Hello, welcome to Behind the Wall. I'm Stan Grant. China's ambassador to Australia, Zhang Jingye, held a rare press conference in Canberra yesterday to reject accusations of human rights abuses in Xinjiang province.
There has been quite some distorted coverage about Xinjiang in certain Western media. And those reports are basically based on disinformation or misinformation.
But as the reports outlining the detention and abuse against the ethnic Uyghur Muslims continue, there have been calls for Western nations to do more, with some, like the US and the UK, imposing sanctions against China. While Australia has welcomed the move, we are yet to impose sanctions of our own. Natasha Kassam is the director of the Lowy Institute's Public Opinion and Foreign Policy Program, and she joins me now. Natasha, good to have you with us. I want to go first of all to what Australia could do. There's been a lot of talk about implementing something along the lines of a Magnitsky Act, and this is something that the US had imposed, targeting people in Russia who may be implicated in human rights issues or abuses. It goes to travel restrictions or financial restrictions and the like. Could we see a Magnitsky Act or something like that in Australia targeting potential individuals in China?
Thanks for having me, Stan. It's certainly possible, and I would say likely, for Australia to pass an act of this nature that would give it the power to sanction officials associated with human rights abuses in China. To date, Australia does level autonomous sanctions on a range of individuals in other countries, but it is under an established regime. China is not a part of that regime to date. And so at this moment, Australia doesn't have the ability to level travel or financial sanctions on Chinese officials.
There's a bit of a shift, isn't there, at the moment, certainly when it comes to actions against China because of the treatment of Uyghur Muslims. We've seen the UK and the US, the EU, Canada Act. How much pressure then does that put on Australia to follow suit?
I do think there's a significant amount of pressure from Australia, from those partners and allies that you mentioned, and also from within the country itself here in Australia. I mean, as you say, the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, European Union, these are the kinds of lists that Australia wants to be on as a general rule. We tend to act with those countries where our interests are aligned, and certainly in condemning potential genocide in Xinjiang, our interests are aligned. Having said that, I do think that there's an issue where Australia has not necessarily been willing to take these kinds of concrete policy measures that the United States and other countries have taken on human rights issues.
Yeah, and Natasha, I'll just come in on that because, of course, you've pointed this out in things you've written before too. The stakes are so high. There's going to be retaliation, no doubt, if Australia was to go down that path. And traditionally, we have not aligned questions of human rights with trade issues or trade agreements. That would be a shift, wouldn't it?
There is definitely a difference between the way Australia approaches trade agreements to, say, some European countries and the United States, where there are trade requirements and human rights and labour requirements written into those agreements. Australia hasn't tended to go down that path. We also haven't ratified the part of the International Labour Organization's requirements on forced labour. So there are other things that Australia could be doing, but I think at this moment, most pressure is on the idea of Australia being able to target individuals with sanctions.
And of course, that does raise the question of what would China do? What do you think the response from China would be? And we've had an indication for the news conference that was given by the ambassador here in Australia as to the approach that China takes when it comes to questions of Uyghur Muslims, which is to deny. What approach do you think, what response will we see from Beijing if Canberra was to take this type of action?
We're seeing a full court press from Chinese officials in trying to tamp down on some of this criticism of their policies in Xinjiang. That was very clear, as you say, in the press conference held by the Chinese embassy in Canberra yesterday. What is happening here is I think they are seeing some of these policy movers that are moving in a particular direction and really trying to limit that criticism in advance. Were Australia to pass its own version of a Magnitsky Act and level sanctions at Chinese officials, I think there's no doubt at this point there would be retaliatory sanctions placed by the Chinese government on Australian officials and academics, potentially. Now, we already have Australian academics and other researchers who are not able to travel into China, so there's a question as to how much this would actually change the situation on the ground. But, there's a very good chance that China would escalate in response to Australia levelling these sanctions.
Natasha, what is the end game here for China? This is a high stakes game from Xi Jinping. He's fighting on many fronts. The question of Taiwan, which is constantly in the news, and he's ramping up the pressure there. Of course, what we've seen in Hong Kong, there's the disputed border with India, the South China Sea, and now targeting Uyghur Muslims in what some in the world are calling genocide. So where does this end? What is the end game? How does China, what does China want out of this, and how does it withstand the pressure that is building from the international community?
The question of what China wants is a really challenging one, but I think at a very baseline, we could say it wants full and unfettered control over what it sees as its own territory, which of course is very much questionable in the case of Taiwan and elsewhere. And it wants to have very little dissent or criticism outside of its own borders. It also wants other countries to preemptively defer to its own interests. All of these issues are so fraught because they are tied up in China's ideological project. And whether China is able to achieve this endgame depends as much on Washington, Canberra, Tokyo, and Southeast Asia, elsewhere in the world, as it does on the thinking in Beijing and in Zhongnanhai.
Natasha, there are also calls now coming for a boycott of the Winter Olympics in China next year. The US is seriously looking at this now as well and is calling potentially for allies to join them in that. What's the likelihood of that? And what would that mean? That would be a significant step up, wouldn't it, on what we've seen from the international community?
There's no doubt that in Beijing's eyes, a successful Olympics in 2022 is a part of their national project and a source of pride for the entire country. It would be a real issue of legitimacy if there were actual worldwide and broad-ranging boycotts against these Olympics. But when we're talking about a boycott, it's a really complicated issue. Is it the athletes that shouldn't participate? Is it the companies that shouldn't sponsor the Olympics? Is it somehow a government decision? In 1980, Australia didn't join the United States in boycotting the Moscow Olympics, where here in Australia, we had a difference in opinion between the government and the Australian Olympic Committee. So these are fraught issues, and there are real questions of who gets to make these decisions.
Natasha Kassam, it's been a pleasure to have you on speaking to us. Thank you again for giving us your time.
Thank you for having me, Stan.